induced technology hypothesis, Acemoglu and Marx on de-skilling innovations. I touch on a number of things, but I want to first begin with the motivation and how it has evolved. It all began with the general skepticism with skill-biased technological change. All kinds of evidence that seemed to contradict skill-biased technological change started to accumulate by the turn of the previous century, right? The skill premium was stagnant, actually. Demand for skills started to fall. In fact, what we had was a bifurcation of skill premium. The skill premium for the very skilled kept going up, but skill premium measured in terms of the return on higher education, that began to stagnate. So why was demand for skills falling? And education was supposed to be a big panacea in this new economy, and that clearly wasn't happening. So that's the beginning point. So I started with Acemoglu, who had refurbished the theory of induced technological change. There's literature going back to the 60s. He took this technological change, induced technological change literature, and applied that to come up with the theory of, if you like, the foundation of the skill-based technological change. He formulated two effects, the price effect and the market size effect, which basically says that the technological change is induced in order to economize the more expensive factors. So that is the price effect. And the market size effect is basically when technology is induced to make use of a factor that becomes very abundant. And his story of what was happening in the 20th century in the United States primarily, but applies to other advanced countries, is that skill premium kept rising, even though there was, because of education, a steady increase in the supply of skilled workers, right? So that huge increase in the supply of skilled workers because of increased education would normally reduce the return on skills. The reason that did not happen is because of the market size effect on induced technological change. So the demand for skills as a result increased even faster than the increase in supply. That's basically the story. Now, the interesting question then becomes, if that's what explains what happened in reaction to increased supply of skilled labor because of this huge increase in education, what about the effect of globalization? Globalization did a number of things, but one of them clearly was this significant increase in the supply of unskilled workers. So if market size effect is more significant than price effect, then what would that do? So that was what the paper starts out with. And in fact, you can show that in fact that leads to a reduction or stagnation in skill premium, but there are a number of anomalies that does not explain what has been happening. Most notably, it does not explain the bifurcation of return on skills and so forth. Now, to address those issues, the paper proposes to go back to Marx. Now, what was happening with globalization, to my mind, was so similar to what was happening in 19th century England, right? You had all these people coming from the countryside. There was a huge increase in unskilled workers, but yet these unskilled workers could not be employed because they didn't fit into the production process, which was run by skilled craftsmen, right? So what had to be done before capitalism could make use of this abundant increase in unskilled workers was to transform the labor process. And that raised the demand for very high skills. So in the paper, I basically tried to come up, trying to avoid as much as technical, unnecessary technicalities and rely on graphs. Basically try to introduce this and try to show that the bifurcation of skills, demand for bifurcation of skills, is basically a story of demand for high skills rising so that they could transform the labor process in such a way globally, such that this plethora of unskilled workers could be employed globally. That's the basic story. Why does it matter? There are a number of issues that came up, and I'm going to talk about how it affected my thinking about these, a number of questions. But let me start with relatively more straightforward points and then move on to a number of other things. One interesting thing that comes out of this is the methodological point, right? It basically suggests that microeconomics cannot be done without macro foundations. Now, the term macro foundations, or the criticism of, if you like, mainstream microeconomics on the basis of macro foundations, is something many of us are familiar with, but usually that point is made on the basis of effective demand, right? So here, this is not a point about effective demand. This is a point about network effects, right? Think of the global supply chain. In the age of the virus, right, COVID, we're sorely reminded of its importance as it became disrupted. Well, how can we think about microeconomics, firm behavior, without taking into consideration how the firm fits in some kind of a supply network, right? That's a new meaning of macro foundation. So in the paper, I start out by critiquing a way of doing economics on the basis of production functions that look at individual entities and so forth, and try to introduce these network effects in terms of what I call the balance condition. So that's point number one. The second point is it says something about our understanding of the labor process. And this is the Marxian literature that goes back to the 1970s. There hasn't been much lately, but in the 1970s especially, there was a large literature on labor process. Usually, at least the way I understood it, might be my problem, but usually this literature on Marx emphasizes the problem with distribution, right? So you have capitalists, and this in Marx, Marx makes a distinction between formal subsumption and real subsumption. So in the case of formal subsumption of labor, the capitalist is still dependent on craft skilled craftsmen, right? And so in order to overcome that dependence, they transform the labor process, and so forth. Now, in the paper, actually, we see that there's a deeper layer. There's a deeper layer goes beyond distribution, and that's why the kind of modeling I do abstracts away from distribution, not because that's not important, but because I'm trying to get to this deeper layer. What is that? Well, that deeper layer is, how do you overcome diminishing returns? In order to overcome diminishing returns, you have to go beyond crew-based production. And so this is another point. It basically looks at the labor process literature from a different angle and has interesting implications. Now, so that's point number two. The point number three, which has been a surprise to me and kept me probably more busy, is that the overall implication of the paper and its approach to technological innovation It basically provides a vantage point that somewhat is different from creative destruction, the Schumpeterian or Marxian creative destruction. It basically makes us realize that when we look at the level of society, the capacity to innovate is a resource. It's almost analogous to a natural resource, right? It's a magic wand. That magic wand is being used, right, in a blind fashion under capitalism. Until deregulation, let's say the 1980s and so forth, of course, national security concerns had claims on this magic wand. Think of the Manhattan Project. Manhattan Project is an instance where this society used this magic wand, okay? So there was a military complex and so forth, but it wasn't the profit motive, it wasn't the markets, it was the war, right? The war effort and so forth. Now, after deregulation, after the end of Cold War, and after the defeat of the unions, we entered a very different phase. And I think the most innovative aspect of the paper, when you sit back and think about it, is who controls now this magic wand? And here we get the inklings of a negative view of technology, one that deviates from creative destruction because of the nexus with inequality and asymmetric power. People might be familiar with Surveillance Capitalism, a very interesting book by Zuboff, or the Israeli historian slash philosopher, a short history of the future and so forth, which really had an impact when I first read it a year ago. It turns out now the fantasies, almost trivial fantasies of the very rich, is now having a guiding impact on how the society uses this magic wand. I suggest everyone to read that couple of books, and you'll see that there are two ways in which technological innovation is acquiring a new modality. One is there's the tremendous amount of research and innovation that's going into conquering death, and that's the story Hariri describes, and it's a world that most of us don't even have an inkling of. And the second one is the induced technological change in order to have predatory power and competition. So this is again a Marxian point. It's more on Marshak than perhaps Schumpeter now. It doesn't necessarily come out right. I mean, when you think about platform technologies, the way the social information technologies has evolved, the new technologies that are being induced are not necessarily at the end things that help society, right? So the point is, what are we doing this magic wand society has? Recognition of this resource, because we are not, I think, as a society, aware of this resource. And the big point is acquiring some kind of a democratic control over it. But before we can have democratic control over it, we have to become cognizant of what it is, right? So the existence of this resource and democratic control over it is the first point. And the second point, when we leave it to the market, the blind forces of the market, is the dissipation of skills. So one thing that is, the paper explains what bifurcation of skill, return to skills is all about, is this excessive competition that leads to premature obsolescence of skills. And that's what is stagnating the return on, the paper argues, higher education premium and so forth. And that really, when we look at it from a resource point of view, is really dissipation of this resource. Okay, this leads to one other point, and it's a more general issue. How do we deal with collective costs? There is something about theorizing about the state and institutions, right? The capitalists are supposed to use the state as their executive committee, right? Going back to the manifesto. But when do they do a poor job of this, and when do they do a good job of this, right? It's, in other words, how do capitalists solve their collective action problem? That's what it comes back to, and that's what I've been interested in some other related work. So in this case, there's a collective benefit, and capitalists, can they use it in their collective interest or not? Or forces of competition actually produces a result that is not only negative from a social point of view, but even from the point of view of the collective interests of capitalists. There are so many different things, more at a technical level, but in terms of a big picture level, let me talk about the things that I've been thinking about and picking on the last point that I made about collective cost. I think one issue that's been on top of my mind with climate change and all the things that are going on is institutional failure. How do capitalists act in their collective interest? How do they act in such a way that furthers their interest? The state might do a poor job, it might do a good job. Just because capitalists control the state doesn't mean that the collective costs are not going to be taken care of. That's one general issue. And the other issue, there are a number of technical issues in terms of understanding productivity stagnation. That's a whole another avenue. It goes in a very different direction. And when you enter into empirical research, there are all kinds of problems. One gets into problems that I wasn't fully appreciative of when we try to estimate productivity changes and so forth. But in the paper, I think there is some kind of an explanation why we have the productivity stagnation at a time when you have, in a sliver of the spectrum, rapid increase in skills. So that's one research program that will probably require empirical skills that I don't have. So I'm trying to tempt others to work with me on that. On the other side, how do we account for class agency at a more conceptual level, right? And the crucial issue here at the very simple level is that there has to be some collective threats before it turns out the capitalists can work to overcome the prisoner's dilemma competition is, right? Think about it. Actually, the very origins of prisoner's dilemma was meant as a theory of competition, right? So we can look at institutions from the prism of how capitalists try to come up with a cooperative solution to that prisoner's dilemma. And in that process, collective threats, whether it's coming from workers or whether it's coming from Soviet Union and so forth, help. And when you don't have those, actually, the cooperative solution begins to unravel. And I think that's what is going on today. That's my way of looking at institutional decay and so forth. So there are so many different issues related to that, but let me leave it at that.